If you're a Magic player who hangs out with people from other card games, there's a good chance you've heard the term boss monster more than a few times. This is a very common phrase in Yu-Gi-Oh! And the term has gone on to be somewhat popular in other TCGs like Digimon. Despite this, the term has never gotten traction in the original trading card game, and in fact, the concept it refers to essentially doesn't exist. So, it's only natural to ask the question, why doesn't Magic the Gathering have boss monsters? Before we can get to the question of why, though, we need to talk about what boss monsters even are. Boss monsters is a fan term, so there isn't a strict definition. It's more of a general vibe that the player gives to certain cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Basically, the term is used to describe the final boss of a deck or an archetype. Archetype in this case refers to a group of cards that are all designed to work together by Konami. These monsters typically have a few things in common. They're difficult to summon, at least compared to the rest of the cards in their archetype, have very large stats, and have extremely powerful abilities. They're generally the scariest thing your opponent could summon against you in their deck. Now, with this description, the concept doesn't sound that out of place in Magic. Couldn't you describe something like Grizzlebrand or Autarka World Render as boss monsters or boss creatures for their decks? They check about all the same boxes, and while that may be true for a few decks and cards, there are some distinct differences if you look at the games as a whole, which is why a similar concept never really popped up in Magic. Now, we could just start listing all the differences one by one here, but doing that wouldn't really be all that informative. The differences between top-end threats in Magic and boss monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! Aren't just around the margins, but in their very purpose in the game. So to get a feel for the differences, we'll need to start at the very beginning. First, we need to go over what the purpose of creatures and monsters are in the two games. We'll start by asking a different question. What is Magic Gathering about? What is Yu-Gi-Oh! About? This may seem like a very broad question, but the answer is simpler than it may first appear. At least the answer that we're looking for in this discussion. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a bit of a strange franchise conceptually. It focuses mainly on an anime centered around at the time of being written, fictional card game that then became a real card game based on that show. A lot of the most famous characters in Yu-Gi-Oh! Aren't even on any cards. Yugimoto is maybe the most famous character in the series, being the main character of the first anime, and there's not a Yugimoto deck. Same with Seto Kaiba, Joey Wheeler, every one of the most famous characters in the show are largely absent from the card game, but their cards are not. Everyone remembers all the characters' most famous monsters. Dark Magician, Blue Eyes White Dragon, and Red Eyes Black Dragon are all in the very first sets of Yu-Gi-Oh! And some of the most desirable cards from those sets. And this is incredibly important to what the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is. Now, while these monsters, in of themselves, weren't characters driving the plots of the show, they were important to their duelist in the show. The heart of the cards isn't just a trick Yugi used to draw the perfect card every time he was in trouble. It was the theme of the show at some level. It was about the love of the game and the emotional connection to the duelists in the show that they had with their decks and the monsters in them. And as the audience for the show would form an emotional connection with the characters of the show, they then formed a connection with those characters' decks. In the fiction of playing a duel of Yu-Gi-Oh!, the duelists are taking the role of the characters. And the main appeal of the game for a lot of young players was getting to have that connection with the monsters. The monsters of Yu-Gi-Oh! Are the face of the game. And getting to use those monsters in battle is the main fantasy that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is selling at a conceptual level. It also helps that monsters, being living beings, are also very easy for people to form emotional connections with. The average person is going to have a stronger emotional reaction to cards like Sangan than they are Raigeki, unless they already understand a great deal about the game. So we've established that the monsters of Yu-Gi-Oh! Are a big force behind its marketing and the fantasy of playing it. The next obvious question is how that differs from Magic. Unlike some other card games, the gameplay of Magic the Gathering all explicitly takes place inside of a specific framing device. In the lore of Magic, the players are all planeswalkers, a powerful type of mage within the lore, and the game that's taking place is essentially a wizard duel. A player's library is their library of spells, their hand the spells that they're thinking of at that moment, and the creatures they cast are the creatures planeswalkers are constantly depicted as summoning in lore. This is why creatures used to be called summon spells, by the way. The idea is that the act of casting a creature was the players summoning a spell, and summoning the creature from somewhere else. The critical thing about this layer of fiction is that the decks in Magic are supposed to allow a player to be any kind of mage they want. Richard Garfield, the designer of the game, has also gone on record stating that he wanted vastly different styles of play to exist in the game. It wasn't supposed to be all fair Magic, just creatures all over the place, but instead, tons of different strategies were meant to be viable all at the same time. Sure, you can summon a ton of creatures and attack your opponent, but at least in the very early days of Magic, dealing with creatures was more of a suggestion than a requirement. If you wanted to play as a Pyromancer and just cast nothing but direct damaging spells, you could do that. If you wanted to be a Necromancer resurrecting dead creatures, you could do that. And if you wanted to build a Rube Goldberg machine that resulted in you winning the game in a ridiculous way, you could do that. Magic was always meant to be darker and aimed at a bit of an older audience than Yu-Gi-Oh! Ended up targeting, and the players were meant to be attracted to the idea of playing the game in whatever way they wanted, more so than having a mascot or group of characters they would grow emotionally attached to. Now, it's not like other card games didn't pull from this well at all. Yu-Gi-Oh! Did still have more back row or spell/trap focused decks, which is the game's equivalent of instant sorceries, artifacts, and enchantments. However, especially as the games evolved, you can see how there is a difference in design philosophy as well as in basic gameplay that led to wildly different gameplay experiences. And those different types of gameplay are why we eventually end up with a boss monster in one game and none in the other. The best place to start in seeing how these different design philosophies spiraled out into wildly different games is by cataloging the evolution of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Boss monster. The first boss monsters in the game were the iconic Blue Eyes White Dragon and Dark Magician from the very first set. While these cards are very valuable and famous, they're also pretty terrible. As a level 7 and level 8 monster respectively, the way you were supposed to get them into play was by tributing 2 monsters on your field. This would take up your 1 normal summon per turn, and each of the 2 monsters would require a normal summon to get out, at least in the early days of the game. This meant that getting those famous boss monsters, that once again are the most marketable parts of the game, take a huge investment to ever play, which wouldn't be a huge deal if the game didn't have so many cards that punish you for trying to play these cards. Just in the first set, there was single target removal with things like Maneater Bug and Trap Hole that could 1-for-1 trade with these cards, instantly putting the player who tried to summon them at a huge tempo and card disadvantage. While they did have nice high attack stats, in practice they were outpaced by other, easier to summon threats in the long run. Early Yu-Gi-Oh! In general was defined by powerful defensive options. You had a ton of cards that could be normal set in defense position that no normal summon could easily clear, like Giant Soldier of Stone, and flip monsters which would wreak havoc on your opponent if they allowed them to flip. Now, these flip effects could be destroyed by things like Raigeki, which would stop them from using their flip effects. There were also a ton of cards like Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest that let you add a monster from deck to hand when they were destroyed by any means, not just by battle. That made you have to be wary of when you use your removal. That's not even getting to the blowout cards like Mirror Force that punish attacking, and single target removal like Fissure. All of these together made consolidating all of your resources into a single 2 tribute monster ill-advised. Now, this wasn't inherently a problem for the game, but it wasn't what Konami probably wanted. It's not exactly a good look when you have a set named Legend of the Blue Eyes White Dragon, and said card is just unplayable. So Konami went ahead and started finding ways to facilitate more powerful monsters being the star of the show. This was a slow process, of course, with a lot of development over several sets. The first really notable stop in this development is Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning. This is a light warrior monster with 3000 attack, tied with Blue Eyes White Dragon, and has a ton of effects. It can't be normal summoned from your hand and must be special summoned by banishing a light and dark monster from your graveyard, banishing being the equivalent to exile at Yu-Gi-Oh! Then, once per turn, you can use one of the following 2 effects. They can target any monster on the field and banish it, but it can't attack this turn. Or if it destroys the monster by battle, it can make a second attack this turn. Blackluster Soldier, or BLS, is the first boss monster that was really good in Yu-Gi-Oh! Its cousin, Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy of the End, was also quite good, but it got banned pretty quickly because of some combos, so we're not going to talk about it right now. Anyway, BLS was a really strong card when it was printed. Dark was one of the best attributes in the game, and there were more than enough lights you could play to consistently summon BLS later on in the game. Once you did, BLS was a great way to swing for lethal thanks to its huge attack stat and ability to attack twice. It was also really good against a lot of the more defensive options popular at this point in the game. It could banish face-down monsters, which could stop any flip monsters from getting their effects, and because it banished, it wouldn't trigger Sangan and its friends. The main weakness of this card is that it was weak to cards like Ring of Destruction and the like, but because Yu-Gi-Oh's priority system worked more like Magic's did this time, you could at the very least banish at least one monster before your opponent got a chance to remove it. Blackluster Soldier was good enough to see a ton of play around the time of its printing, and maybe more importantly for the discussion we're having here, it was one of the first monsters that made you feel like you were a duelist in the anime when they summoned it. It was big, flashy, practical to use in a competitive setting, but not strictly better than literally every other monster in the game at the time. Blackluster Soldier would sort of become the blueprint for future boss monsters. They had a specific condition for special summoning them, rather than interacting with the tribute summon mechanic. and would have extremely powerful effects that usually represented a powerful form of interaction. The next major step in boss monster design came several years later when Yu-Gi-Oh! Introduced the first extra deck summoning mechanic, Synchro Monsters. Now, if you're a Magic player, you can think of the extra deck as a command zone of 15 monsters that could be summoned by various means. Synchros in specific required a tuner monster and some number of non-tuner monsters as materials. If you had a tuner and a non-tuner that met the synchro requirements and whose levels added up to that synchro monster's level, you could send those monsters from the field to the graveyard and synchro summon the monster from your extra deck. For an example, if you had Krebons, a level 2 tuner, and a DD Warrior Lady, a level 4 non-tuner, you could summon a level 6 synchro monster from your extra deck by sending them to the graveyard, such as Bryonic, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. However, some synchro monsters had additional requirements, like Yugioh Guardian, which requires an Earth tuner monster, so you would have to use a card like Nettles instead of Krebons to summon it. Now, the introduction of synchro monsters had two huge effects on boss monster design. First off, a lot of boss monsters are now extra deck monsters, so players have access to them at any time they can fulfill the summoning requirements. This has influenced deck design a lot, as players don't have to hedge their bets in case they can't find their boss monster, so they're free to build their decks around facilitating summoning them. Secondly, it allows for decks to play with multiple boss monsters for different situations. The extra deck is a bit of a toolbox that players could go into and find the best card for any situation. And while you do have to jump through some hoops to summon them, with more and more cards at special summon being printed, that wasn't so difficult to do. Yu-Gi-Oh! Also started pushing into archetype design more and more over time, which became very apparent by the time Synchros came out. Again, archetypes here means a group of cards that all work specifically with each other. The vast majority of archetypes receive their own boss monster, which were designed to be the top-end threat for the deck. For example, XX Saber Gothams is the boss monster for the X Saber archetype. This was a level 9 synchro that required at least one Earth non-tuner to make, which wasn't an issue for X Sabers because they were all Earths. That allowed you to tribute any number of X Saber monsters to make your opponent discard a random card for each. Another big part of the archetype design that may seem strange to Magic players is that a card like Gothams can check just the names of cards to see if they can be used for its ability. Any card with X Saber anywhere in its name at all can be tributed, whereas Magic cards usually only refer to cards by their full name, making this type of design impossible. Anyway, Gothams is a good example of how boss monsters were designed to be the payoff of their decks. X-Sabers had cards like Airbellum that were essentially Hypnotic Spectre in Magic, ripping a card randomly from your opponent's hand whenever it hits your opponent. Gothams could come down after battle once you get enough monsters on field and tribute whatever X-Sabers you had left to rip apart the rest of your opponent's hand, which is incredibly powerful. Additionally, Gotham shows another upside of the idea of boss monsters in the game like Yu-Gi-Oh!, mainly that they allow the designer to put more powerful effects on cards that they can put on, say, the average spell or trap card. If Gothams was a spell or trap card that could be activated with no investment, it would be pretty backbreaking, as spells and traps have no costs associated with playing them in Yu-Gi-Oh!, at least not inherently. However, most boss monsters require several cards worth of investment to bring out, as they have to be synchroed into or tributed to bring out, or in the case of BLS, require you to set up cards in your graveyard before they can come out. These summoning requirements let players make splashier plays, while also giving the cards a cost, which lets your opponent have a way to counteract with what you're doing. For reference, the card Confiscation is banned in Yu-Gi-Oh! To this day, while Gothams is perfectly legal. Confiscation is essentially Thoughtseize, letting you look at your opponent's hand and make them discard a card. Because it doesn't require mana to cast, you could just play multiple Confiscations on turn 1, or play them and do the rest of your turn without giving up any tempo, which was incredibly broken. Gothams' effects is a bit worse than Confiscation, but even if Confiscation discarded at random, the card would still be very playable just because it would have no real cost whatsoever. Gothams, being a synchro monster that requires more setup to get out, allows the designers to put an effect that's normally just too good into the game without much of an issue. Before we go on, we really need to emphasize the importance of archetype design that was becoming popular around this time. Archetypes would only become more and more relevant as time went on in Yu-Gi-Oh!, as it helped to make every deck feel unique by giving them access to their own powerful cards. As time went on, Konami would print more and more focused archetypes, often with clear gameplays and combos designed into the deck. This is, to a Magic player, extremely strange. While Wizards of the Coast will print new mechanics and synergies from them into sets, Magic has always had a very sandbox approach to deck construction. Wizards has an idea of what the meta will look like, but outside of color restrictions, they let players play whatever cards they want in their deck. This is sort of an extension of the idea that players' overall strategy is entirely up to them. Just like how you want to approach Magic is completely up to you, and forcing you to play a certain type of card would be against Magic's philosophy. Printing cards that demand you to play a bunch of other specific cards also generally goes against that philosophy, which is why it's done relatively sparingly. The types of locks that Konami puts on cards restricting them to an archetype, such as cards like Qliphort Scout restricting you to only summoning Qli monsters, would therefore be unthinkable in Magic. The Qliphorts are an extreme case in Yu-Gi-Oh!, but versions of this idea show up everywhere in Yu-Gi-Oh! And almost nowhere in Magic. This is very relevant to the idea of boss monsters, because archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh! Very clearly have a designated boss monster for their deck, such as Qliphort Towers in the Qliphort archetype. Even the highest rarity legendary creatures in Magic don't necessarily need to work with the rest of the cards in the deck. For example, look at Anafenza the Foremost. This is a 4/4 for 3 mana and in lore is a leader of the Abzan clan in Takir. She has the abilities where, if a creature would be put into your opponent's graveyard, it's exiled instead. So essentially a one-sided dimensional fissure, and when she attacks, you would give another tapped creature you control a +1/+1 counter. The Abzan's mechanic was Outlast, which lets you tap a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and the main idea behind the deck was that they had cards like Abzan Falconer that gave abilities to all of your creatures with +1/+1 counters. While Anafenza does put counters out, that's all she has to do with the rest of the Abzan cards. The Graveyard Hate effect is completely unrelated to anything else the Abzan do. And in fact, Abzan decks in Standard mostly played her because she had good stats for a 3 mana, and the Graveyard Hate was really good in certain matchups. This would be kind of weird in Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially now. Why would the most iconic creature or monster in an archetype barely synergize with the deck? It would be a weird choice with how focused most Yu-Gi-Oh! Design is on making distinct packages of cards that all work together. This is one of the first places we can see the very different design philosophies between the two games lead to one game with bosses and another without them. Anyway, over the years, Yu-Gi-Oh! Introduced several more summoning mechanics, but the overall shift in boss monster design remained the same after Synchros. Boss monsters became more accessible for the majority of decks, as each archetype is given their own specific bosses, and boss monsters are allowed to be a lot more powerful than individual spells and traps in some ways. Switching gears to Magic, it went down a very different road in terms of card design. In the early days of the game, rather than trying to make its creatures more flashy and trying to balance monster effects versus spells and traps, Magic had a very different but no less important question to answer. Specifically, how do you allow decks that are so varied in how they play from each other to all coexist in the same space? As we said earlier, Magic was designed around the idea that each player could choose how they wanted to approach the game and find what strategy they enjoyed the most. So if one player wants to try and lock down the game by playing a ton of removal and board wipes, how do you give the player that wants to cast a ton of easily removable creatures a fighting chance? Well, with mana, obviously. One of the simplest and most important lessons players learn as they start to pick up the game is the mana curve. Essentially, this describes the progression of the game as players play their lands turn after turn, slowly getting access to more and more mana. Cheaper cards don't just take up less mana in the late game to play, but they can also be played out turns earlier than more expensive cards. Of course, to balance this out, more expensive spells are far stronger than those that cost less mana, often completely invalidating cheaper spells from your opponent or outright letting them have access to more cards, giving them card advantage. The existence of the mana curve gives games a flow to them, and importantly, introduces the idea of speed to the game. The faster a deck is, the fewer turns it takes for the deck to win the game and vice versa. The faster a deck can win, the more likely they can win the game before their opponent can ever get their game plan together. However, that doesn't mean that the slower decks are simply worse. Slower decks are spending all that time that they're not summoning, winning, doing other things like drawing cards, getting 2-for-1s, or digging for a combo. While they won't be able to end the game quickly, if their deck is able to get up and running, most fast decks, which are built around a swath of cheap, efficient threats, simply won't be able to keep up. The reason we care about this is that having decks operate at different speeds allows for decks to approach the game completely differently, but still have a fighting chance against each other. Decks can simultaneously specialize in swarming the board with small creatures, removing your opponent's cards, or trying to combo off. However, you'll never be completely out of the game, as you can always try to either go under your opponent or outrun them, or go over their game plan and slow the game down enough until you can just do something more powerful than what their deck can handle. This is all pretty basic stuff if you've been playing the game for a while, of course. But one of the benefits of this design that goes unmentioned is that it allows Magic to accommodate many wildly different types of strategies and decks without invalidating anything. If one player wants to play a game dictated by creature combat and another doesn't, they can both do that and the game will be fair. From this, a few deck archetypes emerge. Archetypes here meaning a general grouping of decks with the same game plan, not what archetypes are in Yu-Gi-Oh! These archetypes were aggro, mid-range, control, and sometimes combo. and they all approach creatures in different ways. Aggro aimed to kill your opponent as fast as possible, so it just played all the cheapest, most efficient threats in the game. Control tried to slow down your opponent with removal and board wipes, and the only creatures it would play were whatever was the most difficult to remove, so they could close out the game after they had wrung their opponent dry. Mid-range is, as the name implies, the midpoint between these two styles of plays. It plays a mix of creatures and removal, usually playing just whatever was the best creature on raid in any given format. Now, each of these deck archetypes would look at creatures in a different way, and none of them looked at them the same way that decks in Yu-Gi-Oh did. Whereas boss monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh were generally payoffs for certain strategies, Aggro, for example, just looked at creatures and asked how much damage a creature would deal in the average game against your opponent. They played a low curve, and the most expensive creature in the deck was generally just determined by a combination of how long it would take for them to kill your opponent, and therefore how many lands they expected to have in play, and what was good at dealing a lot of damage when it was played. Control decks often would skip out on creatures entirely, which has only become more common with the introduction of planeswalkers into the game. Since these were the decks most likely to play cards like Wrath of God, playing creatures was often actively counterproductive, as they would all just die when you cast your next board wipe. You could call whatever creature or planeswalker they landed on their boss creature, but those were by far the least important part of the deck. In fact, at times, the best control win condition has been cards like Elixir of Immortality, that lets you just shuffle your graveyard into your deck so you can wait for your opponent to deck out. Mid-range decks, as the midpoint between these two strategies, generally selected their creatures just by what happened to be best in their colors into whatever was most popular in the metagame. The last common archetype in Magic are combo decks, and the term combo deck means something very different in Magic than it does in Yu-Gi-Oh! In Yu-Gi-Oh!, a combo deck in the modern day is usually a deck that spams a lot of special summons to summon a ton of very powerful boss monsters, most of which would have the word negate written on them somewhere. The end result is usually them having so many forms of interaction that almost none of your opponent's cards will resolve on the following turn, and then they can go into battle on their next turn and just kill them. In Magic, you skip over all of this and just kill them right away. Magic has a lot more infinite combos that result in burning your opponent out, or milling them out, or resolving some sort of old win condition. Go ahead and punch out that Banalog's video mentions Thassa's Oracle section of your bingo cards, by the way. These decks are kept in check by needing to find their cards and then get enough mana to play them, which in most formats takes several turns or their entire hand if they're using fast mana. This, alongside a few cards like Force of Will, which are basically hand traps for Yu-Gi-Oh players, are enough to keep these decks in check. Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh, this kind of thing is essentially impossible to balance. The only time combo decks in Magic will use creatures is if they're part of the combo or can help facilitate it. So they're not using them the way Yu-Gi-Oh is either, if you account for how different combo decks are across the two games. So, in summary, every archetype of deck in Magic uses creatures in a different way, and all of them are different to current Yu-Gi-Oh! Aggro uses them for early pressure, mid-range uses them to stabilize the board, Control might play them to end the game, and combo decks will play them as part of their combo depending on the deck. Generally, creatures were used to fight for board or end the game, not as the powerful top-end threats of strategy. The closest thing you'd get to a creature being used like they are in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are creatures who are only played for their abilities, such as Edgewall Innkeeper, which was more like what they'd be called a starter or extender in Yu-Gi-Oh!, not a boss monster. The reason for this is that if you want to build your deck around an effective magic, you need to be able to get to it and deploy it quickly. High mana value spells are simply too unreliable unless you're an all-in combo deck. As a result, the cheaper spells are more likely to be the centerpiece of a deck strategy, rather than being a stepping stone towards a boss monster. Additionally, since high mana value creatures come down so late, all they really need to do is end the game. Whereas in current Yu-Gi-Oh, boss monsters are usually used as what's called an end board piece, an idea that's non-existent in Magic. The reason for this is that Magic had no reason to put the most powerful effects on hard to summon creatures like Yu-Gi-Oh did. Magic could make a card like Overwhelming Splendor, which in Yu-Gi-Oh terms is essentially Mystic Mine, that never turns off, and is perfectly fair because it's an 8 mana spell that's very difficult to ever actually resolve, rather than just being able to be activated from your hand whenever. This means that interaction has primarily stayed on non-creature spells. However, in Yu-Gi-Oh, if you want to set up a lot of interaction for your opponent's turn, you'll usually summon boss monsters that have effects that mess with your opponent. A lot of these interactive cards would be too good if they were simply spell cards that could be activated without cost, so they were put on boss monsters that took more resources to summon. In Magic, a mana cost on any card is essentially the same as any other kind of spell, so this shift towards powerful interactive creatures never happened. Elder Gargaroth, for example, is huge, has 3 combat keywords, and lets you choose between making tokens, drawing cards, and gaining life when it enters combat. It's just a huge body that gives you card advantage or ends the game faster, but you having it on the field doesn't inherently stop your opponent from doing anything. All of this comes to a head in how combo decks operate in the two games. In Magic, combo decks require mana and take up a ton of resources to try to combo, so they're allowed to literally result in your opponent losing the game on the spot if the combo goes through. In Yu-Gi-Oh, this would just be broken. So any infinites generally have to be either so hard to do they're not viable, or they get banned. Combining this with the fact that the best interaction in the game is often to put a boss monster out, and the best combo decks are decks that simply make as many types of removal as they can on their turn 1 to try and stop you from being able to play at all. Boss monsters in modern contexts are generally just the best things to summon on your turn 1 to mess with your opponent. If you can't win the game right away, what's left but to put yourself in position to stop your opponent from doing much of anything? Magic really never ended up in this position, because every combo deck just did their combo and won on the spot. So they didn't need a ton of cards that were both strong attackers and extremely potent forms of disruption. The result is that there was never a shift towards the creation of what is now known in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! As boss monsters, because the game didn't have any need for that kind of card. While a bit long-winded, that's essentially the answer to the question of why Magic doesn't have boss monsters. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game about summoning powerful monsters, while Magic is a game about tempo and card advantage, and to some degree, finding whatever style of play fits you best. In order for Yu-Gi-Oh! To be a game about summoning monsters, the monsters had to be worth playing, so they were pushed to prominence over the course of the game's history. Magic, on the other hand, was fine with creatures being one style of play of many, and while they may have pushed them more over time, that was mostly to bring them in line with other strategies that were too good early on. Additionally, the difference in game design between Yu-Gi-Oh's more focused archetypes and Magic's more broad, sandbox-style card design made having a face of a deck less important in Magic, so there was never anything that could be identified as a boss monster. All of these decisions come down to differences in design philosophy, but they spiral into so many differences due to the constant evolution of the games.